The Novorossiysk was originally the Italian dreadnought battleship Giulio Cesare of the Conti di Cavour class. The Italian battleship was constructed following the success of the first Italian dreadnought, Dante Alighieri. Being complete in 1914, she saw service throughout the First World War, and during the 1930s, she was extensively modernized. With a new raked oceanic bow, revised armor and weaponry, new superstructure, and machinery. When Italy entered the Second World War in June 1940, she led Italian forces in one of the first major engagements, the Battle of Calabria, withdrawing after sustaining damage from a hit from HMS Warspite. Following the battle and repairs, she was present at Taranto when the British attacked the port in November of 1940, although not sustaining any damage during the attack. Going on to take part in other surface actions and convoy operations until spring 1942, when she was placed in reserve at Taranto, shifting to Pola, where she served as a training ship. After the armistice, she was decommissioned until after the war. Giulio Cesare was transferred to the Soviet Union in 1949 as part of war reparations paid by Italy. Renamed Novorossiysk, she sank on October 29, 1955, after most likely hitting a German wartime mine while anchored off Sevastopol. Now, if you've seen my original video on Giulio Cesare, and if you haven't, it will pop up on screen now to give you her full story. Still, a problem I had near the end was that I didn't have very much information on Giulio Cesare's service with the Soviet Navy, and because of that, I didn't detail it very much. Well, this video is going to rectify that. However, it is disclaimer time once again, as this video was kind of tough to research, and I feel it's appropriate to say, as a disclaimer, I am not a historian, I do not have a degree, and I have never claimed to be one. I do my best to select sources, of which a majority are secondary sources, and therefore I use my best judgment to sift through the information they present. I will always try my best to give you all factual information, and specifically in this video, I will try to give you what little information there is to help show the full picture. With all of that being said, let's continue. Following the signing of the armistice in September 1943, Italian ships, including Giulio Cesare, left Italy for internment in Allied ports, where some of Giulio Cesare's crew, resenting to having to turn their ship over to the British, en route to Malta, they effected what amounted to a mutiny, seizing control of the ship in order to sink her in deep water, relenting only after the captain solemnly pledged not to allow the British to take possession of the ship under any circumstance. This was only one of a few episodes of reaction to the armistice within the Regia Marina, either ashore or at sea. All of this to say, Giulio Cesare was not going to see service for the remainder of the war, having her crew reduced and the ship remaining at Malta for the foreseeable future, where unfortunately she was at the mercy of the weather, having damage done to her during her time there. There was hope in the Italian government that Cesare and some of the other battleships could be brought back into service following the war, with the government going as far to detail how this could be done. The problem was Joseph Stalin longed for a modern navy, including modern battleships, hoping to receive one of the Littorio class as reparations, as well as more ships. He was promised a portion of the Italian fleet in a prior meeting with the Western powers, but, spoiler alert, he wasn't going to get a modern battleship. Although he did receive the British Royal Sovereign temporarily, we will cover her terrible service with the Soviets at some point down the line. Anyway, Giulio Cesare eventually returned to Italy in June 1944, where, after handing over the firing mechanisms to British authorities, she laid in Taranto's Mar Piccolo in desperate need of repairs, at reduced readiness, and active, being this way up until January 1946, where the ship was placed in available status. This only lasted a year when she was placed back at reduced readiness, awaiting the fate reserved to her by the peace treaty. On February 10, 1947, Italy signed the peace treaty imposed on her by the victors in Paris, involving the loss of territory, material, and moral sacrifices, where Ermino Bagnesco and Augusto de Toro in Italian battleships Conti di Cavour and Duilio classes 1911 to 1956 write, "The greatest bitterness came from the treatment of the Italian fleet, as if it were war booty to be divvied up amongst the victors. The battleships were divvied up, with the British and Americans receiving 2 of the Littorio class, and the Italians were allowed to keep the Duilios. With the Conti di Cavour sunk, it left the Giulio Cesare to be handed over to the Soviet Union. Like I mentioned before, the Soviets were promised a portion of the Italian fleet, totaling some 51,464 tons, including the Giulio Cesare, a light cruiser, 3 destroyers, 3 torpedo boats, 2 submarines, and 35 other vessels. The treaty was not exactly popular with the Italian people or navy. Again, quoting De Toro and Bagnesco, The delivery of these ships was seen by Italian sailors, as well as by the greater part of the population, not only as unfair and humiliating, but also as a renewed and unequivocal sign of defeat, which co-belligerency had managed to erase from the memory of many. The delivery of the ships was going to be made because of the discipline of the officers and crew, avoiding the real danger of the possible dissolution of the Italian navy. It should be noted that some plans were foiled to sabotage Giulio Cesare and other ships before they were handed over to the Soviet Union. This theme of Italian anger is something that will be important later on, so keep it in the back of your mind. By the time Cesare was going to be transferred to the Soviet Navy, she had been inactive for the better part of 3 years, almost devoid of crew, at a very reduced state of readiness, and not in great condition. The treaty stipulated that the ships were to be ready for service, i.e. in operational condition, by September 15, 1947, which for Cesare was not going to happen. This will become apparent shortly. After some negotiating, Moscow agreed in July 1948 that the ships could be handed over in their current condition. The Giulio Cesare and other ships promised to the Soviet Union were on their way with their stores full of everything the ships could need, making a stop at the Albanian port of Valona where the ships were going to be handed over. On February 6, 1949, the documents were finally signed, handing the battleship over to the Soviet Union. The Italian crew was treated rather harshly, quickly removing them from their post and keeping them under guard on the forecastle. The Soviets were very worried about the prospect of sabotage, something that might have happened to another Russian dreadnought, the Empress Maria, 42 years ago at that point. The Soviets searched the ship up and down, looking for any explosive devices, but they didn't find any. The ship assumed, although still provisionally, the name Novorossiysk, in honor of the city of that name on the Black Sea, which had resisted a prolonged German siege, arriving in Sevastopol on the 26th. The Soviet authorities began to complain almost immediately with the condition the ship was in, with Stephen McLaughlin and Soviet and Russian battleships reporting her condition with the armament, main machinery, hull structure, bulkheads below the waterline, armored deck all being satisfactory, while the bulkheads above the armored deck, watertight doors, and hatches were unsatisfactory. Things that were in poor condition were the piping, internal communication systems, auxiliary machinery, firefighting systems, and diesel generators, which were non-operational. Bagnesco and De Toro describe her having rust almost everywhere, and the light anti-aircraft guns being useless due to their poor condition. Italian sources report the Soviets who were in charge of the handover were mainly inspecting the ship to see if everything was there, and if there were any attempts to sabotage the ship, not the state the equipment was in. Maintenance was constantly carried out on the ship before her official entrance ceremony to the Black Sea Fleet on March 5, 1949, being given a cleaning and a fresh coat of gray paint. The ship was subject to propaganda as a great triumph for the Soviet Union, as it had acquired a battleship from a defeated fascist foe. Despite the fact that the ship was not modern and of a type that was largely outdated, it was nevertheless the largest ship in service with the Black Sea Fleet. Being such, she became the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, assuming the role of a training ship to get the sailors of the fleet ready. But a lot of her time in Soviet service was spent being refit. Between 1949 and 1955, she underwent 8 rounds of work, major and minor, including the complete overhaul of her machinery, meaning her boilers and turbines, along with replacing a lot of the auxiliary machinery and emergency diesel generators. Next, her main battery was planned to be changed with new Russian 305mm guns, but the ship was lost before this change could occur. The major armament modification was the replacement of the Italian 20mm guns with more modern Soviet anti-aircraft guns. New fire control systems, telephone systems, and other upgrades made the ship quite capable by the spring of 1955, even though she had been in service for nearly 40 years. The nearly 1,600 men and officers on her were finally getting the hand of the elderly battleship when in October 1955 she would finally meet her end. In the late afternoon of October 28, 1955, while returning from a 12-hour training cruise to the area of Cape Violet, the Novorossiysk, still flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, dropped her portside anchor off the Naval Hospital and then moored fore and aft buoys. These buoys were supposedly securely attached to the ship. A little while later in the evening, the captain of the battleship and his deputy went ashore for the night, replaced by the number 3. After dinner, 240 men of the crew were allowed to leave as they had leave, being replaced by some 200 naval cadets and civilian workers, bringing the total of those on board to about 1,350. This was the situation on board when, at 1:30 a.m., a violent explosion occurred, where McLaughlin writes, "At 0130 hours the next morning, a tremendous explosion shook the ship. It occurred on the starboard side just forward of number 1 turret, in the vicinity of frames 35 through 40. As was later revealed, a hole about 150 meters squared had been opened up in the ship's underwater side. The explosion was so powerful that it blew upward through all the decks, making a hole 4 meters by 14 meters in the forecastle deck forward of the turret. The compartments between frames 23 and 50 were immediately flooded, and soon afterward, the forward magazines were also filled with water through a damaged bulkhead. The flooding very quickly extended aft to about frame 67, by which time they had taken on 3,500 tons of water. At 1:40 a.m., after the first few minutes of confusion, the Commander-in-Chief of the Black Sea Fleet, Vice Admiral Alexandrovy Parkhomenko, from now on referred to as the CNC, was informed of the incident and reached the ship at 2 a.m. Despite using all the pumps that were still in working order, the ship was taking on a lot of water. The CNC was informed that only 1,200 tons of water was on board, but like McLaughlin wrote, it was closer to 3,500 tons, or 15% of the ship's normal displacement. The plan was for the ship to be towed, as it was losing buoyancy rapidly, to a place nearby so it could be safely beached. By 2:20, though, the forward portion of the forecastle deck was at sea level, and as a result, the 4 foot of the base of the stem post was already burying itself in the mud of the Black Sea, while damage control parties from other ships were arriving on scene to assist. On the deck, there were several hundred sailors who were not directly involved in the rescue operations, not of much use, and were moved around the deck slightly aft where the watertight doors were still holding. Before 3 a.m., attempts were being made to rapidly raise steam, which was possible because the machinery spaces were undamaged by the mysterious blast. At 3 a.m., the CNC assumed control over the rescue operations, which before were carried out by men of lesser rank. The CNC decided against evacuating some 800 sailors who were on deck and not assisting in the rescue operation. In his judgment, this was unnecessary and would lead to panic that was not needed in this already serious situation. The mud I mentioned before was greatly hindering the efforts of the tugs, and the most that they could do was haul her stern around and bring her closer to shore. The ship was listing more and more to port. At 3:30, it was 12 degrees, and by 4, it was 17 degrees, despite the fact that attempts to right the ship were occurring at that very moment, including trying to dam the waters at frames 50, 74, and 85. Even with these efforts, at 4:14, almost 3 hours after the explosion, with about 7,000 tons of water in the hull and a list of more than 20 degrees to port, the ship began to settle rapidly. This sudden rotation did not stop until the upper superstructure and masts began to settle in the mud. Although slowing, the rotation continued until 10 p.m. on October 29th, with a list to port of 172 degrees, or essentially upside down. Many of the crew were able to slip into the water as the ship went over, being picked up by numerous rescue vessels, while others had been caught up in the ship's superstructure. As for those who were stuck in air pockets in the upside-down ship, there was little hope, with only a few men being rescued from the overturned ship. The total losses were 609 or 608 dead, as the sources vary. To quote Bagnesco and De Toro again, "It was the greatest peacetime disaster in the history of the Russian Navy, and, as always is the case, was followed by a serious inquest to determine the causes and responsibilities. However, as we shall see, it also led to several absurd, if not ridiculous, conspiracy theories of political fantasy." The Novorossiysk was stricken from the list of Soviet ships on February 4th, 1956, and the following summer, the challenging work of recovery began. The wreck was floated with its keel uppermost in a series of flotation cylinders lashed to both sides by May 4th, 1957. Then the combination of ship and cylinders was towed to a small base with a suitable bottom, where the ship was righted and broken up. An investigation was started almost immediately following the disaster. The authorities in Moscow were keen on figuring out what just happened to their flagship in the Black Sea. The commission consisted of qualified naval personnel and was headed by an engineering corps general and a vice admiral. Once arriving in Sevastopol, the commission began examining hundreds of witnesses, while frogmen and divers inspected the battleship's hull, assessing the damage and sounding the bottom all around the mooring in position 3. The work proceeded very quickly, and by the 17th of November 1955, the commission was able to present a preliminary report to the party's Central Committee. The conclusions of the document accepted and approved the fact that the damage to the Novorossiysk was not attributable to any malicious or accidental explosions, ammunition, fuel, or flammable materials internal to the ship, but rather an external underwater explosion by a charge equivalent to 1,000 to 1,200 kilograms of TNT. In other words, the most likely culprit was a German wartime mine laid before May 9th, 1944, the date the Germans had evacuated Sevastopol, surprisingly remaining active and perhaps buried in the mud. At a glance, a mine seems rather unlikely, given the numerous minesweeping operations between the war and 1953, and according to the Commission, it was a German RHM bottom type. The mine was essentially a robust wooden box that was laid by a surface vessel containing an enhanced TNT charge, with the sensing element being a magnetic induction type powered by special batteries that had a maximum lifespan of 9 years. This mine was one of the most powerful mines found in the Bay of Sevastopol during the clearing operations, which led to the discovery of at least 19 large magnetic German mines, all of which were in the vicinity of the number 3 mooring where the Novorossiysk was. It is not known if any of the mines found later in 1956 and even later were still active. The mine that likely sunk Novorossiysk was an exception and not a rule, with both the battery and trigger mechanism still working. Also, given the fact that this specific mooring had been used 134 times by large warships, and thus with a large magnetic field. There were several hypotheses put forward, one of the most likely being there had been some blockage of the activation mechanism, which had occurred when the mine was laid, or caused by an accidental bumping on an anchor chain, which would have temporarily rendered the mine inactive and reactivated by later contact with a chain during the battleship's final mooring. The Soviet frogmen carried out a sounding on the seafloor and found, a week later after the explosion, the likely crater of the mine on the seafloor, and further testing showed the damage to the battleship was caused by an enhanced TNT charge. The report further detailed how rapidly the ship turned over and the serious loss of human life. There were going to be consequences with such a large disaster. Disciplinary measures were addressed to many high-ranking officers up to the CNC of the Soviet Navy, Admiral Kuznetsov, who was forced to leave his post because he was falsely charged with the Sevastopol tragedy and was accused of responsibility in connection to the technical and organizational shortcomings the disaster brought to light. Speaking of those technical shortcomings, the investigators decided that one of the factors contributing to her loss was a lack of substantial technical documentation in the damage control post. McLaughlin writes about the lack of documentation, corresponding more to a minesweeper than a battleship. Some primitive plans, 10 manometers, pressure gauges, an inclinometer, and wretched phones. Communication equipment was improved in subsequent refits, but adequate damage control documents, including stability curves, were never received from the Italians, although they had been requested. After the disaster, the Kremlin issued the news that the ship had been destroyed by internal fires and explosions, which remained the official story until the end of the Cold War. The unofficial cause, and more likely one, the German mine, was known in the West. However, the report did give us some other options to look at, including a torpedo fired by a submarine, attack by frogmen, or sabotage. These attacks were carried out by whom, you might ask? Well, the Italians, of course. Remember what I said earlier about keeping Italian anger in the back of your mind? Where, McLaughlin writes, several more or less exciting theories were advanced at the time of the ship's loss, and others have been added on since then. The most popular one in recent times has been the idea of a revenge attack by former members of Italy's underwater commandos led by Prince Borghese, and this theory has received wide publicity. Its chief proponent has been V.A. Karsavin, and his researchers have indeed revealed such an attack was possible, given security lapses in advance. Unless more convincing evidence is brought forward, there seems no reason to doubt that the ship was lost due to the explosion of German mines overlooked in post-war mine sweeps of the harbor. While Bagnesco and De Toro have this to say, in 1991, the year after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a volume appeared in Russia in which the first doubts were expressed regarding the entire Novorossiysk event. The mine theory was challenged, while at the same time an attack by frogmen, and Italian veterans of the Decima Mas no less, was presented as a more realistic possibility. Since that time, there's been a repetitive cycle of fanciful publications with a flood of theories, each less likely than its predecessor, all, however, coming from the same Italian sources, none of which provide any direct witnesses or documentary evidence to back them up. As fun as the Italian frogman theory is, it is unlikely, and the true cause of the disaster is probably a German wartime mine. Still, I will not say for sure, because it will most likely never be known for certain. Let me know what you all think about the disaster and the real cause of the explosion. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.